late 1942, an airfield in damp grey England. The air is cold and smells of wet canvas, high-octane fuel and mud. To the pilots of the Royal Air Force, huddled in their sheepskin collars, the measure of a fighter is grace. It is the slender wing of a Spitfire, a scalpel of a machine that seems carved from the air itself. Then the Americans arrive, and with them comes their new champion. It does not land. It impacts the runway, a colossal, lumbering beast that shakes the ground. It is the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and it is a monster, 7 tons of metal, built around the largest engine ever strapped to a single-seat fighter, with a fuselage so vast pilots joked they could hold a dance in it. This was the Jug, a nickname born of Mockery, short for Juggernaut. It was, to the trained eyes of pilots who lived or died by the laws of turn rate and climb, an abomination. It was a flying milk bottle, a 7-ton bathtub, an insult to the very concept of aerial agility. This is the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the most misunderstood, maligned, and underestimated fighter of the Second World War. A 7-ton Juggernaut, mocked by its own pilots. That was not an elegant dogfighter, but an indestructible blunt force instrument that would shatter the Luftwaffe by absorbing punishment no other plane could, and delivering a hammer blow of firepower, the likes of which the world had never seen. The men of the US 8th Air Force, particularly the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, were the first to truly grapple with this beast. They were young, aggressive, and had trained on the nimble P-40 Warhawk. They expected a thoroughbred. They were given a draft horse, Robert S. Johnson, a man who would become one of America's highest-scoring aces, captured the universal despair. "My heart sank," he wrote of his first encounter. The Thunderbolt was a monster. We looked at it, walked around it, kicked the tires, and wondered what in the hell the States was thinking of sending us this Jug. Their complaints were not just aesthetic, they were visceral. The cockpit was a cavern. The roll rate felt, as Johnson described, like a loaded truck. Its initial climb rate was pathetic compared to the Spitfire Mach 9th or the Focke-Wulf 190 it was meant to fight. In the low to medium altitude combat that had defined the air war over Europe thus far, the P-47 was a whale among sharks. "We were fighter pilots," Johnson lamented, "and we were given this thing, this 7-ton milk bottle. How were we supposed to fight a 109 or a 190 with this?" It was, we felt, a suicide mission. The Mockery was relentless. Pilots joked that in an emergency, you didn't need to bail out. You could just unstrap and walk around the fuselage to find the problem. They said its wings were not for flying, but for housing the 8 50 caliber machine guns, a payload so obscene it seemed compensatory. The British, with their characteristic understatement, were appalled. Their entire philosophy was built on the lightweight, high-performance interceptor. The P-47 was pure American excess, too big, too heavy, too brutal. It was, they concluded, the wrong tool for the wrong war. But the P-47 was not a mistake. It was a solution. It was the physical manifestation of a uniquely American doctrine, conceived by a man who understood airflow, power, and physics in a way few others did. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's chief designer, had not set out to build a graceful duelist. He had been tasked with solving a complex, brutal equation set by the US Army Air Forces. The requirement was for a high-altitude escort, a bomber's friend, that could fly higher, faster, and longer than any interceptor the Luftwaffe possessed. The key to this, and the reason for the P-47's monstrous shape, was one component, the turbo, supercharger. While the British Spitfire used a brilliant 2-stage supercharger, it was compact. Kartveli, to achieve the performance the USAAF demanded at 30,000 feet, selected the massive General Electric turbo supercharger. This device, essentially a second turbine, was driven by engine exhaust. which in turn spun an impeller to cram dense, compressed air into the engine at altitudes where the air was thin and weak. This was revolutionary, but it created a massive plumbing problem. The turbo itself was a sensitive, bulky unit that had to be placed in the rear of the fuselage. This required an intricate, sprawling network of metal ductwork, an internal nightmare, as one engineer called it, to snake from the engine in the front, carry the hot exhaust gases to the rear turbine, and then pipe the newly compressed air all the way back to the engine's intake. The P-47's enormous barrel-chested fuselage was not fat, it was necessary. It was a metal skin stretched taut over the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, its massive internal ducting, its 300-gallon internal fuel tanks, and its pilot. When pilots like Robert Johnson complained about the size, Kartveli reportedly replied, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good legs." The statistics that made pilots nervous in 1942 were precisely the ones that would later make the Luftwaffe terrified. Its maximum takeoff weight was over 17,500 pounds, more than two times Spitfire's. Its engine, the R2800, was a 2-ton, 18-cylinder radial engine, a power plant designed for medium bombers, not fighters. On paper, it was a statistical failure in the European theatre. The FW-190 Amperes, its direct competitor, was 3,000 pounds lighter and could outclimb and outturn it with ease at 15,000 feet. The Bf-109G was an even more nimble energy fighter. The USAAF's 8th Air Force Command looked at these numbers with apprehension. They had bet the entire strategic bombing campaign on the idea that their B-17 flying fortresses could defend themselves. The disastrous raids of 1,942 proved this a bloody fallacy. They needed an escort, and they needed it now. The P-38 Lightning was in short supply. The new P-51 Mustang was a promising airframe stuck with a mediocre, non-supercharged engine. The P-47, this behemoth, was the only aircraft rolling off assembly lines in the thousands that had the high-altitude performance, the range, with drop tanks, and the sheer power to muscle its way into the Reich. It was a compromise, a gamble born of industrial necessity, not aerial theory. The pilots climbing into the cockpits at RAF Duxford or Horsham St. Faith did not know the theory. They only knew the feel. They felt the sluggish controls, the terrifying stall speed, and the immense weight. They felt, correctly, that they were not in a dogfighter. What they did not know, what they could not yet appreciate, was that the P-47 was something new entirely. It was not a scalpel. It was, as it had been nicknamed, a Juggernaut. And it was about to be unleashed on a German war machine that had no idea what was coming. The education of the 56th Fighter Group and the validation of Alexander Kartveli's dinosaur was about to begin. To understand the P-47, one must first understand the catastrophe that birthed it. In 1942, the United States Army Air Forces was in the business of selling a dream, and that dream was dying in spectacular, flaming wreckage over the fields of France and the Low Countries. The dream, championed by a zealous cadre of officers known as the Bomber Mafia, was that of daylight precision bombing. It was a core tenet of American air power doctrine, holding that heavily armed bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, flying in tight, self-defending combat box formations, could punch their way to any target, destroy it, and return, all without the need for fighter escort. This was not just a theory, it was an article of faith, and in the brutal skies of occupied Europe, that faith was being torn to shreds by the cannons of the Luftwaffe. The 8th Air Force, based in England and commanded by General Ira C. Eaker, was tasked with proving this doctrine. Their early shallow penetration raids in late 1942 were met with savage and effective resistance. The B-17 was indeed a fortress, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns. But the Luftwaffe pilots, particularly the aces of the Jagdgeschwader, were professionals. They quickly developed devastating head-on attack tactics, targeting the bomber's vulnerable cockpits, and found the American gunners' fields of fire were not as all-encompassing as advertised. Loss rates began to climb. 5% was considered unsustainable. On some raids, the 8th was losing 7, 8, or even 10% of its attacking force times per mission asterisk. The crews knew the math. They were being sacrificed on the altar of a flawed doctrine. The self-defending bomber was a myth, a bloody, costly, and demoralizing myth. This was the forge of necessity. The 8th Air Force was facing a crisis that threatened to halt the entire strategic bombing campaign before it had even truly begun. Long before Robert Johnson ever kicked its tires in disgust, the P-47 was rolling off these assembly lines by the hundreds. The USAAF was committing to a plane and a doctrine, sight unseen. They were betting the entire air war on an unproven 7-ton monster. This exposed the second critical failure of American air planning. They had no such fighter. The airframes available were woefully inadequate for the unique demands of the European theatre. The Bell P-39 era Cobra, a favourite of early American planners, was a disaster. Its engine, lacking an effective supercharger, was asthmatic at any altitude above 15,000 feet. The Luftwaffe fighters, operating at 20,000 feet or higher, could toy with it. Then there was the North American P-51 Mustang. It was a beautiful, revolutionary airframe, but the A model was shackled to the Allison V1710 engine. Like the P-39, it was a world beater below 15,000 feet and a breathless dog above it. The miracle of mating the P-51 with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was still a distant dream. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was rugged, but it was a low-altitude brawler already obsolete. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a brilliant and fast twin-engine design, was a high-altitude performer. But in 1942, it was plagued by engine troubles in the cold, damp English air, and more critically, it was in desperately short supply, prioritized for the Pacific theatre. As Ika recalled in his memoirs, the pressure was immense. They were constantly urging us, almost daily, to abandon our daylight concept and join them in the night bombing, to admit our theory was wrong. From the other side, Ika was hounded by Hap Arnold, who demanded results. Arnold needed proof that daylight precision bombing worked, or his entire air force, his life's work, would be relegated to a costly, secondary role. Ika's cables back to Washington became increasingly desperate. He pleaded for patience, but more than that, he pleaded for an escort. He needed a BF, a bomber friend, and he needed it months ago. Into this vacuum fell the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was not chosen because it was the most elegant, the most agile, or the most loved. It was chosen because it was the only times aircraft in the American arsenal, or even on the drawing board, that met the baseline requirements. It was, in essence, the last plane standing. The reason was singular: its turbo, supercharger. The P-47, as designed by Alexander Kartveli, was built times around times this complex, bulky, high-altitude system. It was the only American single-engine fighter that had, from its inception, the ability to breathe in the thin, frozen air of 30,000 feet and still produce immense power. This singular advantage was enough to trigger one of the most incredible industrial gambles of the war. Republic Aviation, a company with a spotty record for fighter design, was given massive government contracts. Its factory at Farmingdale, Long Island, became a temple of mass production. This was a concept alien to European builders like Supermarine or Messerschmitt, who still relied on a craftsman model. Republic built the P-47 the way Ford built the Model T. They used automated assembly lines, specialized labor, and a design philosophy that prioritized ease of mass production and, crucially, field repair. This was the brutal reality of America's air war in 1942. The P-47 was not an aircraft of choice. It was an aircraft of necessity. It was the imperfect, oversized, and unloved champion, an industrial solution to a desperate strategic problem. It was the only thing that could fly high enough, for long enough, and be built fast enough to save the 8th Air Force from self-destruction. And now, its pilots would have to learn to fight with it, or die trying. To truly understand the P-47, one must metaphorically peel back the duralumin skin of the aircraft. What is revealed is not a fighter in the conventional sense, but a revolutionary, and frankly brutalist, piece of engineering. The Thunderbolt was not an airframe designed to be agile, to which components were then fitted. Instead, it was a compromise, a metal sarcophagus built to contain two of the most powerful pieces of machinery in the Allied arsenal, the largest engine and the heaviest armament ever combined in a single-seat fighter. At the heart of the beast was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. This was not a fighter engine. It was a power plant designed for medium bombers like the B-26 Marauder and Naval Corsairs. It was an 18-cylinder, twin-row, air-cooled radial engine, a gargantuan piece of metallurgy that weighed over 2,200 pounds dry, more than the entire airframe of a Japanese Zero. In its initial P-47 iterations, it produced a staggering 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, a figure that would eventually be pushed to over 2,800 horsepower with water injection in later models. This engine defined the P-47's entire character. Firstly, it was air-cooled. This was a crucial, philosophical difference from its European counterparts. The Spitfire, the Bf-109, and the P-51 all used liquid-cooled V-12 engines, like the Rolls-Royce Merlin. These engines were sleek, aerodynamic, and powerful. They were also, however, exceptionally fragile. A single rifle-caliber bullet, a stray piece of flak, striking any part of the intricate, pressurized cooling system, the radiator, the pumps, the hoses, would be a death sentence. The engine would seize in minutes, forcing the pilot to bail out or make a dead-stick landing. The R-2800, by contrast, had no such vulnerability. It was cooled by the air ramming through its massive frontal cowling. It had no glycol blood to bleed. Its cylinders were individual units. This made it, in the words of its pilots, positively agricultural in its ruggedness. The R-2800 could absorb unbelievable punishment. 56th Fighter Group pilot Robert Johnson, in his memoir Thunderbolt, recounted numerous dogfights where his Jug was riddled with 20mm cannon shells. He described landing a plane where multiple cylinders had been shot times, clean off times the engine block, yet the remaining 15 or 16 cylinders continued to pull, dragging him home. This ruggedness gave P-47 pilots a confidence bordering on arrogance. Where a Merlin pilot saw a single spark or hit as a potential disaster, the Thunderbolt pilot knew his engine could chew through shrapnel and keep running. But the engine was only half the equation. The second, and more revolutionary, piece of technology was hidden deep in the P-47's voluminous belly. This was the General Electric Type B turbo supercharger. This was the P-47's secret weapon, the entire reason for its existence, and the sole justification for its 7-ton weight. To fight at 30,000 feet where the bombers flew, an engine needs to breathe. The air at that altitude is so thin that a normally aspirated engine would produce less than a third of its sea-level power. The British Merlin engine used a brilliant, compact 2-speed, 2-stage times supercharger, times essentially a gear-driven air compressor. Alexander Kartveli, however, had bet on the far more complex but ultimately more powerful turbo supercharger . Here is how this intricate system worked and why it demanded such a large fuselage. The 2,000 horsepower R-2800 engine produced a titanic amount of hot exhaust gas. In any other plane, this was vented waste. In the P-47, these incandescent gases were captured and plumbed through a complex network of large, insulated metal ducts that ran from the engine, under the pilot's seat, to the extreme rear of the fuselage. There, the exhaust gas was forced at high velocity against the blades of a small turbine, spinning it at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. This turbine was, in turn, connected by a shaft to a second turbine, an impeller, which was the supercharger proper. This impeller would suck in the thin, cold outside air, compress it to sea-level density, and then pipe it times all the way back, times through another set of ducts to the engine's carburetor. It was an engineering nightmare of hot side and cold side plumbing, a delicate, massive and heavy system, but it was a masterpiece. The turbo supercharger was, in effect, a free engine running on waste energy. It allowed the P-47 to maintain its full 2,000 horsepower output at altitudes far beyond 30,000 feet, higher than any German interceptor could effectively operate. While the FW-190's performance dropped off sharply above 25,000 feet, the P-47 was just hitting its stride. It was, in its element, the undisputed king of the stratosphere. The third and final piece of the P-47's anatomy was its fist, the 8-gun hammer. The P-47 carried a battery of 8 M2 Browning, 50 caliber heavy machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing. This was not fighter armament, it was fortress armament. A B-17 carried 13 of these guns for a crew of 10. The P-47 carried 8 for a crew of 1. The statistical reality of this firepower was an industrial-scale hammer. Each M2 Browning fired at a rate of approximately 14 rounds per second. With all 8 guns firing, the P-47 unleashed a converged stream of 112 heavy, armor-piercing, incendiary bullets times every second asterisk. The total weight of fire was, by some calculations, over 25 pounds of lead per second. A pilot typically carried 425 rounds per gun, giving him approximately 30 seconds of continuous firing time, an eternity in a dogfight. German pilots, accustomed to the 20mm cannons of their own fighters, were utterly unprepared for this. A 20mm cannon shell was an explosive device. A 50 caliber bullet was a kinetic energy weapon, a flying crowbar, as one pilot called it. Luftwaffe Eisheinz Bear, who flew against all Allied fighters, stated that while a P-51 was dangerous, a P-47 was times lethal asterisk. He recounted that to be hit by a Thunderbolt was like running into a wall. The 50 caliber rounds didn't just punch holes, they shattered engine blocks, severed wing spars, and disintegrated control surfaces. Combat reports from the 56th Fighter Group are filled with clinical, almost bored, descriptions of FW-190 seconds and BF-109 seconds exploding or disintegrating after a 1 or 2 second burst. This, then, was the anatomy of the beast. It was a philosophy of steel. It was not a duelist's rapier, all finesse and grace. It was an executioner's axe. It was built around the most durable engine and the most powerful supercharger, armed with the heaviest firepower and wrapped in the thickest metal skin. The P-47 was a 15,000-pound projectile designed to absorb any blow and deliver one single, apocalyptic blow in return. The pilots didn't have to love it. They just have to learn how to aim it. The crate was a coffin. When the first P-47 Thunderbolts arrived at the 8th Air Force bases in England in late 1942 and early 1943, they were not flown, but shipped. They arrived disassembled, packed in massive wooden boxes, and were pieced together in the cold, damp hangars by mechanics who scratched their heads at the sheer scale of the components. The pilots, gathered at bases like Duxford and Horsham Street Faith, watched this process with a deepening sense of dread. This was a tale of two very different cultures, two distinct bands of warriors who were about to pass judgment on this new American weapon. The first group was the 4th Fighter Group. These were the rock stars of the 8th Air Force, the former volunteers of the RAF's famed Eagle Squadrons. They were men like Don Blakesley and Don Gentile, pilots who had already cut their teeth against the Luftwaffe's best. They had flown the most beautiful, most responsive fighter in the world, the Supermarine Spitfire. They were masters of the swirling, balletic dogfight. They understood aerial combat as an art form, a duel of grace and angles. They were, in short, disciples of the agility philosophy. The second group was the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by the pragmatic, hard-driving Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke. They were the guinea pigs. They were a green unit, fresh from the United States, with no prior combat experience. They were, in theory, a blank slate upon which the new doctrine of the P-47 was to be written. But they were not fools. They were trained fighter pilots, and they too had cut their teeth on lighter, more nimble aircraft in training. As the P-47 seconds were assembled, the verdict from both groups was immediate, brutal, and unanimous. The aircraft was a catastrophe. For the 56th, the guinea pigs, the experience was one of pure, unadulterated intimidation. Hub Zemke, a brilliant tactician and engineer in his own right, looked at the P-47 and saw a litany of problems. His primary job was not just to fight, but to keep his new, inexperienced pilots alive, and this plane seemed designed to kill them. Robert Johnson, who would later become a 27-kill ace, was open in his memoirs about the near-universal terror. The first challenge was simply getting airborne. The P-47's massive four-bladed propeller needed to bite the air for its powerful engine, required an exceptionally long, stilting landing gear. This meant the pilot sat perched nearly 15 feet off the ground in a nose-high attitude, unable to see the runway directly in front of him. Pilots had to weave, or S-turn, just to taxi, and takeoffs were a blind leap of faith, battling the immense torque of the R-2800. Landings were, in Johnson's words, the most terrifying experience of all. The plane was a hot aircraft. Its sleek, heavy frame didn't want to slow down. It landed at over 100 miles per hour, a speed at which Spitfires were already comfortably in the hangar. On the short, often wet, grass runways of wartime England, it was a 7-ton runaway truck. Johnson wrote, "We flew the Thunderbolt with fear and trembling. Many of the pilots, including myself, were simply scared to death of the airplane." The 56th's initial roll rate was appalling, feeling, as one pilot said, like stirring concrete. In a mock dogfight, a Spitfire could fly rings around it, and the pilots knew it. If the 56th was terrified, the 4th Fighter Group was simply disgusted. They were not guinea pigs, they were veterans, and they saw the P-47 as a professional insult, a betrayal. Don Blakesley, the 4th's indomitable leader, was perhaps its most vocal critic. He had lived and breathed the Spitfire. He understood its nuances, its ability to talk to the pilot. To him, the P-47 was a heavy pig, a 7-ton milk bottle. It was an affront to everything he knew about aerial combat. A famous, and perhaps apocryphal, story circulated. Upon being told he was trading in his unit's beloved Spitfires for the new P-47, Blakesley allegedly stormed into 8th Air Force Command and made a grim offer. He would take the P-47 seconds, but only if command authorized the immediate transfer of his entire group to the ground forces, as they would have a better chance of survival. The sentiment, if not the exact words, was true. The pilots of the 4th saw the P-47 as a one-way ticket. They believed with absolute conviction that they could not times dogfight times the FW-190 or BF-109 inches this times thing asterisk. It climbed like a brick. It turned like a barge. It was, in their professional opinion, a death trap. This initial verdict was not just anecdotal. It was written in blood in the training logs. The P-47 was a deeply unforgiving aircraft for new pilots. The statistics from the winter of 1942 to 1943 are chilling. The 8th Air Force lost dozens of P-47 seconds and, more importantly, their irreplaceable pilots, not to the Luftwaffe, but to training accidents. The sheer number of landing washouts, ground loops and stalls was catastrophic for morale. Pilots died running out of fuel, unable to manage the complex fuel tank selectors. They died when the massive engine torque flipped them over on takeoff. They died when they stalled during a landing approach, the heavy plane dropping like a rock, with no altitude to recover. This grim attrition rate, before a single P-47 had been fired upon in anger, poisoned the well. It confirmed every pilot's worst fears. The brass, in their infinite wisdom, had bought a lemon. They were being sent to fight the deadliest air force in the world, armed with a plane that was, by all accounts, a greater danger to themselves than to the enemy. The verdict was in. From the green pilots of the 56th to the aces of the 4th, the consensus was clear. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a failure. It was a ground support plane, a bomber in its own right, being forced into a high-altitude fighter role it was never designed for. The pilots, strapping themselves into the cavernous cockpits, felt they were sacrificial lambs armed with the wrong weapon for the wrong war at the wrong time. The stage was set for a disaster. The winter of 1942 to 1943 broke, and the order finally came down. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the unloved 7-ton monster, was going to war. In April 1943, the pilots of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups, their stomachs tight with a mixture of fatalism and adrenaline, pointed their massive Jugs southeast toward occupied France. The first missions were not bomber escorts. They were rhubarbs and rodeos fighter sweeps designed to test the waters, build pilot confidence, and hopefully lure the Luftwaffe into a fight. The tension in the cockpits was suffocating. The pilots, particularly the green 56th, were hyper-alert, their heads swiveling, expecting the sky to erupt in a swarm of Fokker-Wulfs. And then, nothing. Day after day, the P-47 seconds thundered over the French countryside, burning thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel, and encountered an empty sky. The Luftwaffe, it seemed, was terrified of their new superfighter. A wave of tentative optimism swept the groups. Maybe this Jug was so intimidating, the Germans wanted no part of it. The reality was far more humiliating. The Luftwaffe, specifically the hardened professionals of Jagdgeschwader 2JG, 2 and JG-26, were not in hiding. They were watching. And they were, for the most part, unimpressed. Their standing orders from high command were clear: do not, under any circumstances, waste fuel and ammunition on pointless dogfights with Allied fighters. The mission was to save every round for the true target, the B-17 bombers. The German aces, observing from 30,000 feet, looked down on the massive American Jabos, fighter bombers, a term of derision, lumbering across France, and simply refused to engage. They noted correctly that the P-47 was a poor climber and turned like a pregnant cow. When the P-47 seconds did manage to get into a scuffle, the results were far from the one-sided victory the pilots craved. The 4th Fighter Group, led by the aggressive Don Blakesley, scored the P-47's first kill on April 15th. But these small victories were overshadowed by a far more insidious and terrifying enemy, the plane itself. The Jug was not ready for war. Its baptism of fire revealed a horrifying list of teething troubles. The most catastrophic failure was the radio. The P-47 was equipped with a new American VHF radio set. It was, in theory, powerful and clear, but the entire British air-sea rescue system and all the Spitfire groups the P-47 seconds were meant to coordinate with operated on HF radios. They were on different frequencies. They could not talk to each other. The moment a P-47 pilot flew over the channel, he was in effect rendered deaf and dumb. He was isolated, alone in a 7-ton machine, unable to call for help, unable to receive warnings, unable to coordinate an attack. Robert Johnson of the 56th described the feeling of complete and utter loneliness. This technical failure was a crisis of morale. Pilots felt abandoned. Then came the other failures. The brand new R2800 engines, so promising on the test stand, began sputtering and failing in the cold, thin air over Europe. Ignition harnesses cracked. Oil lines burst, spark plugs fouled. But the most terrifying flaw was in the dive. The P-47, as pilots were about to discover, had a secret weapon, its ability to dive. But in these early days, it was a death trap. Pilots who nosed the heavy fighter over into a dive found that as they approached 500 miles per hour, the controls would lock up, the aerodynamic forces becoming so great that the pilot's stick felt like it was set in concrete. They could not pull out. Several pilots, trapped in this terminal, high-speed lockup, simply vanished, diving straight into the ground. The plane that was supposed to save the bombers was, for now, a greater danger to its own pilots than the Luftwaffe was. Hub Zemke, a trained engineer, was furious. He worked tirelessly with Republic's engineers, grounding his unit until a new dive recovery flap, a small fin that deployed to alter the aerodynamics, could be retrofitted. While the pilots grappled with their failing machines, the strategic situation in the skies over Germany was collapsing. The P-47 seconds were tasked with their primary mission, bomber escort. But this revealed the final, crippling flaw of the early Thunderbolt, its pathetic range. The P-47, with its massive, thirsty engine, carried over 300 gallons of internal fuel. It sounded impressive, but in the reality of high-altitude combat, it was barely enough. A P-47 group escorting B-17 seconds to targets in France or the Low Countries would find their fuel gauges plunging into the red just as the real air war was beginning. The Thunderbolts were forced to turn back, waggling their wings in a goodbye to the bomber crews, just at the edge of German-controlled airspace. This was the shallow Escort, and it was a strategic failure. The Luftwaffe, masters of the waiting game, knew the P-47 seconds range, or leash, down to the gallon. They simply waited, circling just out of range, until the American escorts turned for home. Then, like a pack of wolves, they would fall upon the now defenseless bomber streams. The B-17 losses continued to mount. The great, disastrous raids of 1,943, culminating in the Black Thursday raid on Schweinfurt in October, were a direct result of this failure. The bombers were being massacred in the deep hot zones over central Germany, areas the P-47 could not yet reach. The P-47's baptism of fire was, by any objective measure, a dismal failure. Its technology was unreliable, its radios were silent, its dive was lethal, and its range was hopelessly inadequate. It had failed to intimidate the Luftwaffe, and, more importantly, it had failed to protect the bombers. The great American gamble on the Juggernaut had, it seemed, been lost. The bomber crisis was worse than ever, and the pilots of the 4th and 56th were left to wonder what, if anything, this monstrous fighter was actually good for. The lesson was learned in blood. In the late spring and early summer of 1943, the first major encounters between the Jug and the Luftwaffe's finest were not victories, they were massacres. A patrol of P-47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group, flying a rodeo sweep near Calais, would be bounced from above by a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds. The German aces, masters of the climb and pounce, would drop on the unsuspecting Thunderbolts. The American pilots, their training screaming dogfight, in their minds would instinctively brake, pulling hard into a turn to engage their attackers. It was suicide. The FW-190, a light, responsive, radial engine fighter, could turn on a dime. The 7-ton P-47, its wings loaded with the weight of a truck, would mush, its turn radius impossibly wide, its controls sluggish. The German pilot, in his lighter, nimbler machine, would simply slice inside the P-47's turn, his 20mm cannons spitting fire, and execute the helpless American. Hub Zemke and his pilots were in a state of crisis. Their planes were failing, their radios were silent, and their core combat training was getting them killed. To fight a Focke-Wulf in a phone booth, as the pilots called a turning fight, was to die. The humiliation was as profound as the losses. The Jug was, as they had all feared, a flying coffin. The eureka moment, like so many in war, was born not of a grand strategy, but of pure, unadulterated terror. It was the discovery of the escape hatch. A P-47 pilot, finding a foe 190 on his tail, his plane shuddering from the impacts of cannon fire, would do the one thing he had been trained times, not times to do in a dogfight. he would disengage. He would jam the stick forward, pointing his 17,000-pound aircraft at the green fields of France, and pray. This was the ultimate sin for a fighter pilot running away. But something astonishing happened. The P-47, its massive weight now allied with gravity, accelerated with a ferocity that was otherworldly. The needle on the airspeed indicator, which had moments before wallowed at 250 miles per hour, would leap 300, 400, 500 miles per hour. The pilot would be slammed forward into his straps. The roar of the R-2000-800 drowned out by a deafening, high-pitched scream of air molecules being torn apart. The German pilot in his Flau 190, attempting to follow, would suddenly find his prey pulling away. He, too, would dive, his own engine screaming. But his lighter, draggier airframe could not keep up. As the P-47 rocketed downward, the German pilot, pushing his own plane past its limits, would hit a wall. His controls would freeze. Or worse, his entire aircraft would begin to shudder violently, a phenomenon known as compressibility. In several combat reports, P-47 pilots looked back to see their pursuers simply disintegrate. The wings would be ripped clean off the fuselage, torn apart by aerodynamic forces the German airframe was never designed to withstand. Robert Johnson described this discovery. We had found the one thing the Jug was good for. We had been trying to fight the 190 seconds and 109 seconds as if we were in Spitfires. We were in a 7-ton brute, and the way to fight was not to turn, but to times go asterisk. When we pushed that nose over, we were the fastest thing in the sky. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could catch us. This was the moment the P-47's identity was forged. And it was Hub Zemke, the brilliant, pragmatic commander of the 56th, who codified it into a new Bible of aerial combat. He gathered his shell-shocked pilots and laid down the law. His Zemke's Wolfpack tactics, distributed in memos that would become the gospel for all Thunderbolt groups, were revolutionary. First, he explicitly forbid his pilots from dogfighting. You are not in a Spitfire, he ordered. If a 190 turns, let him. Do not, under any circumstances, try to turn with him. You will die. Second, he introduced the new religion, boom and zoom, or energy fighting. The P-47's place was high, in the sun, at 30,000 feet, where its turbo supercharger gave it an advantage. From this perch, the pilots were to scan the skies below. When a target was spotted, they were to execute a single, high-speed pass. They would dive, accelerating to over 500 miles per hour, line up the target, fire one devastating burst from their 8 50-caliber guns, and then times keep going asterisk. They were to use their colossal momentum to zoom back up to 30,000 feet, reload their potential energy, and begin the process again. If he turns, you dive, Zemke commanded. If he dives, you dive. You have the weight. Use it. He cannot follow you. You are the rock, and he is the scissors. Do not try to be the scissors. This tactical shift was underpinned by brutal, undeniable physics. The P-47's greatest liability, its 17,500-pound maximum takeoff weight, was, in a dive, its single greatest asset. Mass, when accelerated by gravity, equals kinetic energy. The Jug, with its clean aerodynamics and sheer density, was a runaway train. A P-47 inches a 30-degree dive would accelerate at a rate no other fighter could match. Its terminal velocity was astronomical, approaching Mach 0.8, the sound barrier itself. The FWA 190, by contrast, with its lighter airframe, would hit its own physical speed limit far earlier. The P-47 was, quite literally, a high-altitude battering ram. This new tactic was not without its own perils. The locked controls that had killed early pilots were a real threat. The solution, which arrived in the summer of 1943, was one of the most crucial, yet simple, fixes of the air war, the dive recovery flap. This was a small, wedge-shaped flap, retrofitted to the underside of the wing. When a pilot was in a high-speed dive and his controls froze, he could deploy this flap. It would pop out into the airstream, subtly alter the aerodynamic pressure on the wing, and break the lockup, giving the pilot just enough control to pull out, his body crushed by 9 Gs of force, but times a live asterisk. The arrival of the dive flap, combined with Zemke's new doctrine, transformed the Jug pilots. Their fear was replaced with a cold, brutal arrogance. They were no longer victims. They were executioners. They were no longer dogfighters, a term that now seemed obsolete, quaint. They were energy fighters. They were no longer flying a death trap. They were flying the most powerful weapon in the sky. The Jug's greatest flaw was its greatest strength. They had, at last, found their weapon. Late 1943. The skies over Europe have become an eagle's nest, the high-altitude hunting ground of the Luftwaffe's finest aces, the Experten. But the dynamic has changed. The prey has become the predator. The pilots of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups, once terrified of their 7-ton Jugs, are now the most arrogant, aggressive force in the sky. Their confidence, born from the mastery of the dive, is absolute. They no longer wait to be bounced. They actively hunt. A P-47 group would troll the skies, flying just above the known German fighter bases, daring them to come up. Hub Zemke's wolf pack, with their dive flaps tested and their tactics proven, would fly with a new, lethal swagger. The P-47, the Juggernaut nobody wanted, was about to systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe's home guard, one expert at a time. The fight against the Focke-Wulf 190 was the first and most crucial test. The Focke 190 was, by almost any measure, a superior dogfighter. It was lighter, it rolled faster, and in the hands of an ace, it was a scalpel. The P-47, by contrast, was a hammer, and the P-47 pilots had learned, finally, how to use it. Robert Johnson, now a seasoned ace, described the new tactic. "We'd see them coming," he wrote. "We'd feint. Just a shallow bank, as if we were going to turn and fight." The German pilot, seeing the heavy Jabo commit to a turn, would instinctively pull in, rolling his superior fighter to slice inside the P-47's arc. It was a fatal mistake. The second he committed, Johnson said, "We'd split S, just slam the stick forward and to the side, rolling over into that dive." He had two choices: let us go, or try to follow. If the German pilot let him go, the P-47 was gone, diving at 500 miles per hour, only to zoom climb and re-engage from above. If he tried to follow, he was dead. The heavy Jug would pull away, and the FW-190, its airframe screaming, could not keep up. But this was only half the equation. The other half was the P-47's sheer, brutal indestructibility. German pilots from Juggernaut 26, the elite Abbeville boys who defended the coast, filed reports that were a mixture of disbelief and horror. Their 20mm cannons, which would soar a Spitfire or P-51 inches half, seemed to have no effect on the P-47. Post-war, famed German ace Oskar Heinrich Baer, who flew over 1,000 combat missions, stated, "The P-47, to me, was the most dangerous. To shoot down, it was a problem. You could hit it, and it would keep flying." P-47 pilots would return to base with their planes looking like sieves, entire cylinders shot off the R-2800, sections of the tail missing, yet they landed safely. This invulnerability, combined with the 8-gun buzzsaw that disintegrated any German fighter it touched, created a deep, psychological dread in the Luftwaffe. If the F-190 was a duel of energy, the fight against the Messerschmitt Bf-109G was a battle of altitude. The Bf-109 was a pure interceptor, a point-and-climb fighter. It was light, fast in the vertical, and designed to get to the bombers quickly. But its power was its weakness. It was a thoroughbred, and it was fragile. And, most importantly, its Daimler-Benz engine choked in the thin air of the stratosphere. This is where the P-47's turbo supercharger became the single most dominant piece of technology in the European air war. The Bf-109G's performance began to fall off the curve dramatically above 28,000 feet. The P-47, by contrast, was just getting started. At 30,000 feet, the P-47 was times faster asterisk, it was times more powerful asterisk, and it was times in its element asterisk. The Jug pilots would climb to 32,000 or even 35,000 feet in the sun and look times down times on the German interceptors struggling to reach the bombers. When they dived on the 109 seconds, the results were apocalyptic. The Bf-109, with its light, stressed skin construction, was tragically vulnerable to the 50 caliber hammer. Combat reports from the 56th FG are chillingly repetitive. Saw 109 at 28,000, dived to engage, fired 1 second burst, target disintegrated, engaged 109 from above. Hits observed on wing root and cockpit, aircraft exploded. The 50 caliber rounds, converged to a single point, did not just punch holes in the Bf-109, they shattered its wing spars, ignited its fuel tanks, and quite literally sawed the aircraft into pieces. The statistical transformation from the spring of 1943 to the winter was staggering. The 8th Air Force's kill ratio, once a source of shame, began to skyrocket, with the P-47 groups leading the charge. The 56th Fighter Group alone would claim over 1,000 aircraft destroyed. This was more than just a numbers game, it was a war of psychological attrition. The Luftwaffe was built on a core of Experten, a few hundred highly experienced aces who claimed the vast majority of Allied kills. The P-47, with its new tactics, was systematically hunting and killing these irreplaceable men. The Jugs' combination of high-altitude dominance, extreme speed, and godlike durability meant it could engage the Experten on its own terms, take their best punch, and then blow them out of the sky. The eagle's nest was being tamed, not by a nimble duelist, but by an indestructible high-altitude executioner. By early 1944, the P-47 had done the impossible. It had broken the back of the Luftwaffe's high-altitude interceptor force. It had proven it could win the Escort war, clearing the skies directly over the target for the B-17 seconds. It was the undisputed master of the high-altitude fight. But this victory was, ironically, the end of its primary role. A new fighter was arriving in theatre. The P-51 Mustang, now equipped with the powerful Merlin engine, had a flaw the P-47 could not fix. The P-51 had times range asterisk. It could fly all the way to Berlin and back. And so, the P-51 was given the deep escort mission, the glory role. The P-47, the plane that had single-handedly saved the 8th Air Force from disaster, was about to be handed a new, far more brutal and far more revolutionary assignment. Its days as a Jabo were just beginning. The strategic landscape of the air war was, like the European weather, in a constant state of flux. By the opening months of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had, against all odds, achieved its primary mission. It had mastered the high-altitude fight, broken the back of the Luftwaffe's interceptor force, and saved the 8th Air Force. But this victory was its own undoing. A new fighter, the P-51 Mustang, was now arriving in theatre in massive numbers. And the Mustang, with its revolutionary laminar flow wing, and more importantly, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, had one war-winning advantage the P-47 could never match: range. The P-51 could fly all the way to Berlin, escort the big friends to their deepest targets, and return. The glory role, the high-stakes, high-altitude duel of champions, was handed over, almost overnight, to the sleek, long-legged Mustang. The P-47 groups, the veterans of the 56th and the 4th, the men who had written the book on high-altitude combat, were kicked downstairs. Their new assignment, they were told, was to support the newly activated 9th Air Force. Their new mission was not to fight the Luftwaffe at 30,000 feet, but to fight the German times, army times at 30 feet. They were to become Jabos, the German term of derision, jagged bomber, or fighter bomber. To the aces, this was a profound public insult. Robert Johnson and his fellow pilots were apoplectic. This was a demotion. They were fighter pilots, the new knights of the air, and they were being relegated to the dirty, dangerous, and thankless job of ground pounding. They were being told to trade their epic duels with Focke-Wulfs for the grimy task of shooting up trucks. But a strange thing happened when they took the P-47 down on the deck. The plane that had been a compromise, an unloved beast of burden, revealed its true, final, and most terrifying calling. The P-47 Thunderbolt, it turned out, was not a good fighter bomber. It was, quite possibly, the greatest ground attack aircraft ever built. The first and most important discovery was its survivability. The very things that made it a so-so dogfighter made it an indestructible Jabo. The P-51 Mustang, for all its grace, was a liquid-cooled engine aircraft. Its Merlin engine was a masterpiece of performance, but it was also a Swiss watch, connected by a tangle of vulnerable, glycol-filled hoses. A single, lucky shot from a German 20mm flak gun, one piece of shrapnel from a farmer's rifle, could puncture that cooling system and give the pilot 3 minutes before his engine seized, forcing him to belly land or bail out deep in enemy territory. The P-47, by contrast, was a flying tank. Its engine, the massive R2800 Double Wasp, was air-cooled. It had no radiators, no vulnerable glycol lines. It was a great, iron-hearted, air-cooled 2,000 horsepower engine, as one pilot described it. German ground troops, who had learned to simply hose down the sky at the sound of a P-51, found their ammunition had no effect on the Jug. Flak could tear grapefruit-sized holes in the wings. 20mm shells could slam into the fuselage, but as long as the pilot and the core engine block were untouched, the P-47 simply kept flying. Pilots' memoirs are filled with accounts that border on the mythological. They would return to base with the leading edges of their wings shredded, their tail stabilizers shot to ribbons, and, in Robert Johnson's famous case, an unexploded 20mm shell lodged in his cockpit. They flew home with half their engine cylinders shot away. The Jug's reputation for absorbing punishment was not just a confidence booster. It was a tactical force multiplier. It meant P-47 pilots dared times to go low, to press their attacks with a suicidal aggression that P-51 pilots could not afford to. Then there was the payload. The demoted fighter was, in fact, a stealth bomber. The P-47, with its robust airframe and massive engine, was cleared to carry over 2,500 pounds of external ordnance. This was a statistic so staggering, it was almost nonsensical. A P-47 could carry times more bombs than a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber on some mission profiles. It could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs, one under each wing, asterisk in addition times to its 8 50-caliber machine guns, and a full load of fuel. The 9th Air Force, which now owned many of the P-47 groups, built its entire pre-invasion strategy around this capability. The P-47 seconds were unleashed on the infrastructure of France. Their primary mission, cripple German logistics. This was the birth of locomotive busting. A squadron of P-47 seconds would fly armed reconnaissance along the main German rail lines. When they spotted a train, the results were, as one pilot said, pure D ugly. The P-47 seconds would roll in, their 8 50 calibers acting as a buzzsaw, the armor-piercing incendiary rounds tearing the steel skin of the locomotive's boiler like paper. The train would, in a matter of seconds, erupt in a cataclysmic explosion of steam and shrapnel. In the months leading up to D-Day, P-47 seconds destroyed over 6,000 German locomotives, effectively paralyzing the Wehrmacht's ability to move men and supplies. They strafed airfields, they bombed bridges, they attacked flak towers, acting as flak bait to draw fire away from the medium bombers. They were outfitted with a new, terrifying weapon, the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, HVAR. A P-47 carrying a full load of 10 rockets and 2 500-pound bombs had the in-place firepower of an entire artillery battalion. The demotion was, in fact, the Jug's true calling. It was not a thoroughbred. It was a warhorse. It was not a duelist's rapier. It was a flying tank, an airborne artillery piece, a blunt force instrument of industrial-scale destruction. The pilots, who had once complained about their flying milk bottle, now took a grim pride in their new role. They were the Wehrmacht's personal nightmare. The P-47 had failed to be a good dogfighter, and had gone on to become a great times high-altitude escort. Now, it was on the verge of its third, and most decisive, transformation. It was about to become the single most important weapon on the battlefields of Normandy. June 6th, 1944, H-hour. The cold, grey waters of the English Channel are choked with a steel armada, an invasion force so vast it defies the imagination. On the beaches of Normandy, Allied soldiers leap from their landing craft into a hell of machine gun fire and artillery. And above them, circling in the overcast sky, a new, brutal kind of air cover has been established. This is not the high-altitude ballet of the bomber escorts. This is a low, predatory, and constant presence. This is the P-47 Thunderbolt, in its final and most devastating incarnation. The pilots, many of them veterans of the 8th Air Force now flying for the 9th, are no longer aces in the traditional sense. They are airborne artillery. They have a new nickname for their plane, the Thunder-Bolo, a savage combination of Thunderbolt and Bolo, the heavy jungle machete. Their job is no longer to duel the Luftwaffe. It is to clear a path for the infantry, to hack the Wehrmacht to pieces. This was the cab rank system, a revolutionary concept in combined arms warfare. Squadrons of P-47 seconds, loaded with bombs, rockets, and a full complement of 50 caliber ammunition, did not fly to a specific target. Instead, they took off from their newly bulldozed airfields in England, flew across the Channel, and established a holding pattern over the beachhead, a cab rank of airborne killers. They would circle at 10,000 feet, waiting. On the ground, embedded with the forward infantry units, were Air Force controllers in half-tracks, equipped with VHF radios. When a platoon was pinned down by a German machine gun nest in a French farmhouse, or a Sherman tank platoon ran into an ambush of 88mm anti-tank guns, the call would go out. The controller would radio the grid coordinates to the cabbie at the front of the line. The lead P-47 pilot, who had been lazily circling, would acknowledge the call, bank his heavy fighter, and begin his dive. This was the moment the P-47's design proved uniquely perfect. Pilots like those in the 365th Fighter Group, the Hell Hawks, became masters of this vertical assault. They would nose the Jug over, using its incredible dive speed to scream down on the target, the ground rushing up at them. The accuracy was pinpoint. They were not dropping bombs from 20,000 feet. They were skip-bombing them into bunker slits from 200 feet. They would unleash their 5-inch HVAR rockets, a weapon German soldiers grew to despise, which had the explosive power of a 105mm artillery shell and the accuracy of a rifle. Then they would pull up. The R-2000, 800 roaring, and strafe, the 8.50 calibers, acting as a flying buzzsaw, as one pilot called it, annihilating anything that moved. This system had a profound twofold effect. For the Allied soldier on the ground, it was a godsend. It was the mailed fist from the sky, an on-call, overwhelmingly powerful artillery piece that could be summoned in minutes. But for the German soldier, it was the beginning of a new, psychological nightmare. This was the Jabo Shrek, the fighter-bomber terror. In the memoirs of German soldiers who fought in Normandy, this is the single, defining feature of the battle. It is not the Sherman tanks. It is not the Allied infantry, it is the Jabo. Hans von Luck, a colonel in Rommel's 21st Panzer Division, wrote extensively in his memoirs of the complete and total paralysis the P-47 seconds inflicted. His division, the most powerful armoured force near the beaches, attempted a counterattack on D-Day. It was not stopped by ground forces. It was times obliterated, times from the air. The Jabos, he wrote, were over us. We couldn't move. The moment a tank, a truck, even a dispatch rider, was spotted on a road, a swarm of these fighter bombers would descend, firing rockets and cannons. We were hunted. We could only move at night, and even then, it was a gamble. Soldiers of the 352nd Infantry Division, the hardened unit defending Omaha Beach, reported the same. They were unendurable. The constant threat, the high-pitched scream of the diving Jug, the earth-shattering explosions, and the horrifying chatter of the 50 calibers broke their morale. They were invisible, terrified, and utterly powerless. The P-47 seconds enforced a new rule of war. If you moved during the day, you died. This was the true statistical hammer of the P-47. In the brutal Battle of the Hedgerows that followed D-Day, as Allied forces struggled to break out of the dense Normandy countryside, the P-47 became the great equalizer. The Wehrmacht's doctrinal advantage, the armoured counterattack, was completely nullified. The statistics compiled by the 9th Air Force are staggering. In the period from D-Day to the end of July 1944, P-47 seconds were credited with the destruction of thousands of German vehicles, over 8,000 trucks, armoured cars, and staff cars, and, critically, nearly 900 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles. This was not a war of attrition, it was a war of annihilation. The P-47 seconds, flying from dawn till dusk, systematically severed the Wehrmacht's logistical spine. A German Panzer division, attempting to move from its holding area to the front, a journey that should have taken 3 hours, would now take times 3 days*. It would arrive piecemeal, shattered, demoralized, and having lost half its vehicles, all without ever having made contact with an Allied tank. The P-47, the mocked Juggernaut, had become the decisive tactical weapon of the campaign. It was not just times supporting times the invasion, it was times enabling times it. By establishing total air superiority, not at 30,000 feet but at 30, the Thunder-Bolo was acting as the airborne heavy artillery that the Allied ground forces desperately needed to survive and advance. It had cleared the path, and in doing so, it had set the stage for its single most devastating and most terrifyingly effective day of the entire war. July 25th, 1944. The Normandy campaign, 7 weeks after D-Day, has devolved into a bloody, septic stalemate. The Allied advance is dying, 1 yard at a time, in the green hell of the bocage, an ancient maze of dense, earthen wall hedgerows that the Wehrmacht has turned into a fortress. General Omar Bradley, his first army stalled and bleeding, is about to take the most desperate gamble of the war. Operation Cobra. The plan is not a battle, it is an execution. It calls for 1,500 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators to fly times over times their own frontline troops and lay down a carpet of high explosives on a tiny 7,000-yard corridor of the German line. This, however, is just the prelude. The bombers are the sledgehammer, meant to stun the enemy. The times, real times, killing, the systematic annihilation of the survivors, will be the job of the 9th Air Force P-47 Thunderbolts, who will follow immediately, acting as the scalpel. At the epicenter of this planned man-made earthquake is the elite, battle-hardened Panzer Lehr Division, commanded by General Fritz Bayerlein. Bayerlein, a veteran of Rommel's Afrika Korps, is one of the Reich's finest armor commanders. What he is about to witness will not be war. It will be an apocalypse. The heavy bombers arrive, and the earth is ripped open. For 2 hours, The ground where the Panzer Lehr division is dug in simply ceases to exist, replaced by a roiling cloud of smoke, fire, and pulverized earth. Men are not just killed, they are time's erased asterisk. They are vaporized by direct hits, buried alive in their foxholes, or driven insane by the sheer, unending tectonic concussion. Tanks are flipped upside down, their 50-ton hulls tossed like toys. Command and control, the entire nervous system of the division, is annihilated. General Bayerlein, trapped in this inferno, would later describe the scene in a horrified, apoplectic report to high command. His division, he stated, was bombed to death, wiped off the map, and utterly annihilated. He wrote, "The roads were rivers of fire. The men were, like madmen, reeling in the craters, their faces blackened, their uniforms torn. The front line has been blown from the earth, but the true terror had not even begun. As the last B-17 turned for home, the survivors of Panzer Lehr, the men who crawled from their holes, dazed and deafened, looked up, and the sky, black with smoke, filled with a new, more terrifying sound, the high-pitched scream of the diving Jabos. This was the P-47's masterpiece. This was not a cab rank, not a hunt for targets of opportunity. This was a pre-planned, systematic massacre. The 9th Air Force Hellhawks and other Thunderbolt groups, including the 405th Fighter Group, descended into the 7,000-yard corridor like a swarm of piranhas. The pilots, in their after-action reports, described a scene of surreal, lunar destruction. The landscape was no longer French countryside. It was a cratered, smoking wasteland, choked with the disorganized, stunned remnants of a once proud army. There was no battle. It was, as one pilot said, a turkey shoot. The P-47 seconds, loaded with napalm, fragmentation bombs, and rockets, flew at treetop level unmolested. They were the airborne anvil, hammering the retreating, disorganized German columns that jammed the roads. They hunted down every vehicle that moved, every 88mm gun that tried to deploy. The 8.50 caliber guns, which had once been a high-altitude weapon, were now used to strafe, with horrifying effect, the shell-shocked infantry columns. The statistics of Operation Cobra, and specifically the P-47's follow-up, are the statistical hammer that broke the Wehrmacht. General Bayerlein reported that at the start of July 25th, his elite Panzer Lehr division was a functioning, if mauled, armoured unit. By the end of July 26th, it had, in his own words, only 7 tanks left. It had lost nearly 2,500 men, killed by the bombing. It had, in 48 hours, ceased to exist as a fighting force. The 9th Air Force reports provide the other side of the ledger. On the day after the initial bombing, as the German remnants tried to flee, the P-47 seconds of the 405th Fighter Group alone launched a relentless assault, destroying, by their own count, 122 German tanks, 11 artillery pieces, and 259 other vehicles. It was a day of slaughter. Operation Cobra was the P-47's ultimate validation. It was the single day the Jabo proved it was the most decisive weapon on the modern battlefield. It had not just supported the breakout, it had been times the breakout. The high-altitude interceptor, the mocked Juggernaut, had transformed into a weapon of ground annihilation so terrible that it had, in a single afternoon, shattered an elite army, torn the entire Western Front wide open, and sealed the fate of the German army in France. The war on the ground was a rout, but in the air, a different, more personal war of attrition was reaching its climax. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, its aces dead, its fuel tanks empty. But for the few who remained, the Experten flying the advanced Focke-Wulf 190D Dora or the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262 jet, the P-47 Thunderbolt, represented a unique and profound psychological nightmare. It was not a fear of its agility. The German pilots, to the very end, considered the P-51 Mustang a far more dangerous duelist, a thoroughbred that could outturn and outmaneuver them. Their fear of the P-47 was something deeper, something more primal. It was a Juggernaut phobia, a dread born of its almost supernatural, obscene invulnerability. To the German pilot, aerial combat was a science of applied violence. His aircraft was armed with 20mm or 30mm Minengeschoss cannon shells, miniature, high-explosive grenades designed to detonate on impact. A single, solid hit from one of these shells on a Spitfire or a P-51 was a kill. The wing would sever. The engine's glycol coolant would erupt in a cloud of steam. The airframe would, in a word, disintegrate. This was the law of physics as they knew it. The P-47 broke this law. It broke it daily, casually, and with a brutal American arrogance. The post-war analyses by the Luftwaffe's highest-ranking aces are a testament to this. General Adolf Galland, the former general of the fighter arm and one of history's greatest aces, was not an admirer of American agility, but of its industrial might. He saw the P-47 not as a fighter, but as a war-winning times product asterisk. In his memoirs, The First and the Last, Galland spoke of the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. The P-47 was the physical, 7-ton embodiment of this. It was a weapon that could absorb fatal damage from his best cannons and, in doing so, break the very spirit of his pilots. The P-47, Galland argued, had extraordinary staying power. It was a blunt force instrument that rendered his pilots' skill, their Experten, level gunnery, almost irrelevant. Why risk your life to achieve a perfect 20-degree deflection shot when the target, after absorbing half your ammunition, simply flies away? General Johannes Steinhoff, another legendary ace, echoed this. He spoke of the futility of engaging the Jabos. It was, he implied, a losing proposition even when you won. The P-47 was a symbol of an industrial philosophy that his own craftsman-based air force could no longer compete with. This strategic frustration was felt with visceral, personal hatred by the pilots on the front line. The combat reports from Jug 26 and other home defense units are filled with a sense of utter futility. An expert in his FO 190D, a fast, high-performance prop fighter, would engage a P-47. He would, by his own account, achieve massive hits. He would see large pieces of the fuselage fly off. He would watch his 20mm shells sparkle and explode all over the Jug's wings and its massive radial engine. By every rule of war, the P-47 should be a ball of flame. And then, the Jug would, to the German pilot's horror, level its wings, its R-2800 engine trailing a plume of black smoke, and it would just times keep flying asterisk. It would not crash. It would just, stubbornly, indignantly, fly west, carrying its pilot back to a hot meal and a clean bed. One of the most famous accounts comes from pilots who flew the Me-262 jet. The 262's armament, 430mm Mk-108 cannons, was so powerful it was nicknamed the sledgehammer. A single one of these shells, the size of a beer bottle, could obliterate a B-17. Yet, 262 pilots reported, in a state of near apoplexy, that they would hit P-47 seconds with multiple times 30mm shells, and the American Jabo would still manage to limp home. It was unkillable. It was a monster. This invulnerability was the Jug's final and most devastating statistical hammer. It was not a weapon that won by agility. It was a weapon that won by times cost asterisk. The P-47's true victory was in a logistical and industrial war of attrition. The German High Command, OKL, watched this with growing alarm. The Jabo Schreck, the terror of the fighter bombers, was not just on the ground, it was in their spreadsheets. The German war economy, by late 1944, was crumbling. Ammunition was a resource more precious than gold, and the P-47 was a resource times drain asterisk. OKL reports showed that the amount of 20mm, 30mm, and, critically, 88mm flak ammunition being expended times per P-47 destroyed times was unsustainable. A P-51, hit once by an 88mm shell, was vaporized. A P-47, hit by the same shell, would sometimes survive *, the shell passing through the massive engine and fuselage without detonating or blowing off a wingtip, with the pilot still managing to crash land the airframe. The amount of 20mm and 30mm cannon ammunition required to guarantee a Jug kill was, by some estimates, 5 to 10 times that required for a P-51. The Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe were, in essence, emptying their remaining treasuries of steel, brass and gunpowder at an unkillable target. Each Jug that absorbed a full cannon load from an FW-190 and flew home was a dual victory for the Allies. It was a physical victory, in that the pilot and airframe were saved, but it was a far greater psychological and logistical victory, in that it had bankrupted the German pilot of his ammunition, his fuel, and, most importantly, his morale. The P-47's final victory over the Luftwaffe was not in a turning fight. It was in this cold, industrial equation. It broke the Luftwaffe's morale, it exhausted its aces, and it drained its supply chain. Not by being a better duelist, but by being, as its critics had first called it, a juggernaut. It was a plane that simply refused to die. The final battle of the P-47 Thunderbolt was not fought at 30,000 feet over Germany, nor at 30 feet over the hedgerows of Normandy. It was fought, and won, on the vast, oil-stained concrete floors of the Republic Aviation Factory in Farmingdale, Long Island. This was the other war, the war of logistics, of man-hours, of steel, and of an industrial philosophy that the Axis powers simply could not comprehend, let alone compete with. To walk into the Farmingdale plant in 1944 was to witness a miracle of modern engineering, a spectacle of organized industrial-scale creation. The factory floor was a river of metal, a mile-long assembly line that moved with a relentless tidal certainty. Here, the P-47 was not a weapon, it was a product. It was not built, it was assembled. This was the genius, not just of Alexander Kartveli, the designer, but of the entire American industrial system. The P-47 was, from its inception, designed for mass production. This was a concept utterly alien to the craftsman culture of European aviation. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Supermarine built their fighters like master luthiers building a violin. Each one was a hand-fettled, highly specialized, and complex creation. Republic Aviation, by contrast, built the P-47 like Henry Ford built the Model T. The Jug was intentionally designed in large, simple, modular sections. The entire tail assembly, the wings, the central fuselage each was a sub-assembly, built on its own separate line by a specialized workforce. These massive components were then brought together at the final assembly line, a moving conveyor that, as one worker put it, sucked in a pile of parts at one end and spit out a finished fighter plane every 30 minutes at the other. This modularity meant the Jug was not only fast to build, but astonishingly fast to repair. A P-47 inches England that had its tail shot to ribbons was not repaired in the traditional sense. Its entire tail unit was simply unbolted, and a brand new, crated tail unit from Farmingdale was bolted on in its place. The plane was flying again in 24 hours. A Spitfire with similar damage might have been written off, or spent weeks in a deep-level maintenance hangar, its airframe rebuilt by skilled artisans. The P-47 was the first plug-and-play weapon of war. This industrial philosophy was a strategic weapon, one that the German High Command, and specifically the Reich Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, understood with a cold, intellectual terror. Speer, a brilliant technocrat, saw the war not in terms of battles but of production spreadsheets, and his spreadsheets told him he was losing, catastrophically. In his post-war memoirs, Speer wrote extensively about this hopeless war of production. The German industrial military complex was obsessed with times, quality times, and technical sophistication. They spent priceless time and resources developing wonder weapons like the Me-262 jet, the Tiger II tank, or the V-2 rocket. Each was a technological masterpiece, and each was, in Speer's own words, a strategic disaster. They were too complex, too expensive, and arrived too late, in numbers too small to matter. The Allies, and specifically the Americans, had bet on time's quantity asterisk. Speer noted with a mixture of horror and awe that American production was not based on the individual needs of the front, but was, instead, a gigantic, undiscriminating flood. The P-47 was this flood, personified. It was not a wonder weapon, it was a good enough weapon, produced in numbers that beggared belief. Speer and his planners could not compete. For every advanced FO-190D his factories managed to produce, the Americans were producing 50 P-47 seconds. The final, brutal, industrial hammer is in the numbers. The final, unassailable statistic that defines the P-47's legacy. Asterisk, 15,660, asterisk. In total, 15,660 P-47 Thunderbolts were built, more than any other American fighter aircraft in history. More than the P-51, more than the P-40, more than the P-38. Let us compare this to its enemies. The Luftwaffe's workhorse, the FW-190, achieved a production run of approximately 20,000, but this was over its entire lifespan, in dozens of scattered variants, built in bombed-out, decentralized factories. The Me-262, the jet that was supposed to win the war, saw only 1,430 reach service, most of them grounded for lack of fuel, parts, or trained pilots. The P-47 was a disposable asset. It was an expendable, replaceable component of a vast industrial machine. This was its true invulnerability. The Luftwaffe could, and did, shoot down Jugs. But for every P-47 that fell, there were 10 more rolling off the assembly line at Farmingdale or the second massive plant in Evansville, Indiana. The Allies could times afford times their losses. The Luftwaffe could not. The P-47 was the ultimate expression of the arsenal of democracy, the name President Roosevelt had given to America's industrial might. It was not the most beautiful, the most agile, or the most advanced fighter of the war, but it was the one that arrived in overwhelming, crushing, and unstoppable numbers. It won, in the end, not just by diving, or shooting, or surviving. It won by time's existing asterisk. It was an industrial hammer, and it was the plane that truly broke the Reich. Let us return, for a final moment, to that damp English airfield in late 1942. The Spitfire, a vision of aerodynamic grace, sits on the tarmac. It is a rapier, a duelist's weapon, and the pilots who fly it are artists. Beside it sits the new arrival, the American P-47. It is a Juggernaut, a flying milk bottle, a 7-ton insult to the very concept of aerial combat. The pilots, men who live and die by the laws of the dogfight, look at it with open mockery and a deep, profound fear for their own survival. They were, of course, absolutely right, and they were also, in the grand strategic sense, completely and totally wrong. Their mockery was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the war they were about to fight. They were trained as duelists, but they were about to be thrown into a war of industrial-scale annihilation. They were expecting a fencing match, and the P-47 was a battering ram. It was the wrong tool for the war they thought they were in. It was the perfect times tool for the war that was actually coming. The final verdict on the P-47 Thunderbolt is a story of 3 transformations. It is a story of a machine that was mocked, mastered, and then, finally, revered. The men who came to truly understand it were the aces who had to fly it. Robert S. Johnson, the 56th Fighter Group pilot who had been scared to death of the Jug, who had looked at it with horror, would go on to score 27 aerial victories, becoming one of the highest-scoring American aces in Europe. His final verdict, written in his memoirs, was not one of grudging respect. It was one of profound, deep, and abiding love. The Thunderbolt, Johnson wrote, was the most rugged and dependable airplane I ever flew. It took all my abuse. It took all the enemy's abuse, and time after time it brought me home. This was the refrain, the common hymn of the Thunderbolt pilots. The P-51 was the thoroughbred you took to the races. The P-47 was the draft horse that pulled you from the fire. It was the machine that, no matter how riddled with 20mm cannon fire, no matter how many cylinders were blown off its air-cooled engine, would, through sheer, stubborn, agricultural durability, get its pilot home. The second verdict comes from the enemy it defeated. For the Luftwaffe, the P-47 was a psychological and industrial terror. General Adolf Galland, in his post-war analysis, did not credit the P-51 alone with the victory. He spoke of the extraordinary staying power of the P-47, the unkillable monster that drained his pilots of their ammunition and their morale. For the Wehrmacht on the ground, the verdict was even more simple and more brutal. General Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer-Lehr division was wiped from the map by the Jabo at Cobra, had a simple, terrified respect for the P-47. It was, in his mind, the single weapon that made ground warfare and armoured counterattacks impossible. It was the machine that had personally, systematically, annihilated his army. And so we come to the final, industrial hammer, the summary of its entire career. The statistics of the P-47 are the final proof of the thesis laid out at the beginning. This was not an elegant dogfighter. This was a blunt force instrument of industrial-scale destruction. In total, 15,660 Jugs were built. In their three-act career, they flew over 750,000 combat sorties. They are credited with destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. But this, the role they were designed for, pales in comparison to their true calling as a Jabo. In the final year of the war, P-47 seconds dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. They fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. They launched 60,000 rockets. The final tally of their ground pounding is a logistical apocalypse for the Third Reich. They are credited with the destruction of 86,000 trucks, 9,000 locomotives, 1,200 tanks, and 6,000 armoured vehicles. This was the Juggernaut, the plane nobody wanted, the plane everyone mocked. It was a machine that failed as a dogfighter, only to be reborn as the saviour of the 8th Air Force at high altitude. It was then demoted to ground attack, only to find its true, terrifying calling as the most devastating tactical weapon of the entire war. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the ultimate validation of the American philosophy of war. It was not a rapier. It was the arsenal of democracy made manifest in 7 tons of steel. It was the Juggernaut that, by mastering 3 different roles, saved the air war, enabled the invasion, and broke the Wehrmacht, proving that in a war of industries, the most indestructible, versatile, and numerous weapon will, in the end, be the one that dominates.